Russia's latest budget cuts military spending but pours cash into propaganda to keep control, despite a looming record deficit. Plus, a Russian oil tanker tied to drone attacks on Europe gets snagged off France's coast. We'll tell you more in this episode, so you'll be in focus. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the latest updates. The Kremlin's recent budget reveals a clear shift in priorities towards reinforcing internal control mechanisms. Russia's draft budget for 2026 reveals three key trends: a reduction in direct military spending, an increase in funding for national security, and a sharp rise in internal propaganda funding, with a focus on regional media. Perhaps most telling about all that is the underlying fear within the Kremlin of losing a grip over its own people in 2026. Rather than focusing all available resources on sustaining the war in Ukraine, the Russian leadership is now increasingly investing in the protection of its own power at home. At the same time, the Federation is expecting a record budget deficit by the end of the year. We looked into what the Kremlin will cut back on to keep paying the propagandists.
From 2026 to 2028, Russia's budget for state television channels will amount to a record sum, nearly 246 billion rubles. This is about $3 billion. The biggest increase will be for entertainment and secondary federal channels. Their subsidies will more than double. The budgets for the main Kremlin propaganda channels, such as Channel 1, Russia 1, NTV, and others, will also rise significantly.
Expenses from the Russian budget for state television channels in 2026 will reach 106.4 billion rubles. This is 54% more than previously planned and even exceeds this year's figures. Against the backdrop of a record budget deficit and economic problems caused by the war and sanctions, Russian authorities are cutting social spending and raising taxes for their own citizens. But at the same time, the Russian government continues to generously fund propaganda. From a report by Center for Countering Disinformation of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on Telegram.
Russian society is exhausted by the protracted war against Ukraine, writes Politico. Therefore, the Kremlin is trying with all its might to maintain control over domestic sentiments, launching a new wave of propaganda. For example, recently, Russian propagandists rolled out a whole campaign designed to convince Russian citizens that it was not Russian drones and fighters that invaded the airspace of Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and other European countries, but all of this is European machinations. According to the Kremlin, it is Europe that is behaving aggressively and staging provocations against Russia. The tone is set by top officials. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov accused the West of escalation in his speech at the UN General Assembly, and Putin promised to respond, I quote, "not with words, but with military technical measures."
As Russia probes NATO's eastern frontiers with drones and jets, the Kremlin is rewriting reality for a public worn down by a war. As support for continuing the war drops to an all-time low, the Kremlin pushes a Russia versus the West narrative to boost public morale, from a publication by Politico.
In Russia, by the end of 2025, they forecast a record budget deficit of more than $68 billion. In early September, head of Russian Sberbank German Gref stated that in the second quarter of 2025, the Russian economy essentially stopped. He called it technical stagnation. Already in 2026, according to the budget draft, Russian authorities plan to cut social programs and regional funding. The Kremlin is even forced to reduce spending on the army and military-industrial complex. In 2026, funding will decrease from a record 13.5 trillion rubles to 12.5 trillion. But the Kremlin will not skimp on propaganda. It remains a key tool for control and maintaining power. This is a matter of the regime's survival.
Propagandists report on capturing some small settlements, so-called flag planting. But you can't repeat this forever. And besides, there's the danger that people will finally understand and realize that this war has been going on for almost 4 years. And you have to pretend that everything is actually fine, that everything is normal. You need to normalize the situation in the country. How? With all kinds of entertainment content. Look, we have no problems at all. Everything is fine with gasoline. The oil infrastructure is undamaged.
As long as Russia can generate revenues from energy exports, it will continue the war against Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is convinced. Oil and gas sales are the main source of funding for Russia's military and propaganda machine. Reported by Kristina Dombrovska, UATV News.
It seems Russia may no longer be able to launch drones into Europe from one of its now infamous oil tankers. The vessel was recently detained off the coast of France with suspicion it was part of Russia's shadow fleet. For more details, watch our next report.
On October 1st, French special forces detained the captain of the tanker Barakai and his first mate, announced French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu. The tanker's crew did not provide information on the vessel's ownership and refused to cooperate with French law enforcement. The next day, a crew member was released, and the captain was served a summons to court.
The Chinese citizen, captain of the vessel detained by French authorities, was brought before the prosecutor, who served him a summons to the Brest Criminal Court. The hearing is scheduled for February 23, 2026. The vessel is suspected of belonging to the Russian shadow fleet, from a publication by TF1 Info.
Ces navires présentent un risque en termes de sécurité maritime.
These vessels pose a risk to maritime safety. They are mainly medium-capacity tankers, often old. This fleet is estimated to consist of around 900 ships. They are used to bypass the Russian oil embargo. These ghost ships are also suspected of espionage.
According to marine traffic data, on September 20th, Barakai departed from Russia's Primorsk with a cargo of crude oil on board. Off the coast of France, it anchored. According to Agence France Presse, the investigation is trying to establish whether this tanker is also a platform for launching drones. RFY was the first to report that Barakai is suspected of involvement in the recent drone flights over Denmark.
From September 22nd to 25th, the tanker was off the coast of Denmark. In the period after September 22nd, unidentified drones were spotted over Denmark, including over military facilities of the kingdom. As a result, several airports in the country were closed. From a publication by France 24.
The tanker Barakai is also known by other names, Pushpa and Kiwala. In 2025, it was already detained in Estonia. The Estonian Navy identified over 40 violations, including sailing without a valid flag. However, after the vessel addressed these violations, it was released. The oil tanker of the Russian shadow fleet, Barakai, was added to the UK sanctions list in 2024 and the EU list in February 2025. The vessel is involved in transporting Russian crude oil and petroleum products in violation of restrictions. At an informal EU summit in Copenhagen, President Emmanuel Macron urged allies to intensify pressure on Russia's shadow fleet.
It's extremely important to increase the pressure on this shadow fleet because it will clearly reduce the capacity to finance this war effort for Russia. And it's very important because you kill the business model by detaining, even for days or weeks, these vessels and forcing them to organize themselves differently and killing the efficiency of the business model. And I suggest that in the framework of the coalition of the willing, with close coordination with NATO, we work to see how to optimize this common action.
Meanwhile, the G7 countries agreed to strengthen restrictions on Russian energy exports. This involves trade and other measures against states and entities, helping Russia finance the continuation of the war against Ukraine. This is stated in the final communiqué of the G7 finance ministers.
Now is the time for a significant coordinated escalation of measures to bolster Ukraine's resilience and critically impair Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine. We will take concrete measures to significantly reduce, with the objective of phasing out our remaining imports from Russia, including on hydrocarbon imports, from G7 finance ministers' statement.
Such actions will increase pressure on Russia through coordinated economic and financial measures, the G7 finance ministers emphasized. Reported by Kristina Dombrovska, UATV News.
What's your take on all this? Share your thoughts below. This is UATV. Stay sharp, in focus, and stay safe.